Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my winter reading wrap-up. I've had a really wonderful winter so far, and I'm even more excited for the spring reading, even though I'm not excited for the spring as a season, because after spring comes summer, and that takes a long time to go away. First off, I'm unfortunately only going to give you some teaser reviews of some books, because there are 4 books in this wrap-up that I'm going to be talking about at length in later videos. I read The Story of Alice by Christina Henry upon recommendation of Acacia Ives. Hello! I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think this is a really important book in its discussion of sexual violence, but I will be talking about this more later. I also read The Story of Alice, this is I'm gonna have to just read from the cover. The Story of Alice, Lewis Carroll, and the Secret History of Wonderland by Robert Douglas Fairhurst. Aren't you guys proud of me? I actually got to this immediately, even though it's a big long nonfiction and a big hardcover. Anyway, this got 4 out of 5 stars for completely different reasons than Alice, so you're going to hear me talk about this more later. The third book I'm not going to talk about today is Radiance by Grace Draven. This is a fantasy romance novel, and I give it 5 out of 5 stars. I had so much fun reading this, and I'm so happy to have rediscovered my love of genre romance. On a similar note, I got to Master of Crows, also by Grace Draven. I was just on a Draven roll, a fantasy romance roll, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars as well. In December, I picked up His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman in the hopes of joining along the His Dark Materials read-along. I reread The Golden Compass and gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think it's the same that I bumped it up from 2 stars when I originally read it. And then I got halfway through The Subtle Knife and lemmed it. It was bogging down my reading, it was slowing me down, I wasn't enjoying it, I was bored, I wasn't connecting with the characters, I couldn't do it. I couldn't start my year off feeling sloggy and forcing myself to finish a book. I do want to eventually finish this trilogy, if only to read it once all the way through, but that's not happening anytime soon. Maybe I'll pick it up in the winter months again, maybe in November when I'm not traveling as much. We'll see, but that was a disappointing way, for sure, to end 2015 and start 2016 is by lemming a book. The other disappointing thing that I read this month was Volume 1 of Lumberjanes. So this has been getting a lot of hype and buzz on BookTube. It's a magical realism, girl power, summer camp sort of story with a lot of female writers and illustrators on the team of creators, and then a lot of females in the story. I was so underwhelmed by this. It doesn't help that it took my library 10 months from the day this volume was published to the day it actually arrived to me, and that wasn't because I was position 809th. I was position 3 in the queue for this volume. It took them forever to order it and stop reading it amongst themselves and put it in the system. So I waited 10 months for this. I almost broke down and bought it multiple times. I'm so glad I didn't though, because it was only 2 out of 5 stars for me. I found that it just was too jarring of a storyline. The magical elements I really wanted to enjoy, but they came out of nowhere and weren't explained. Not enough of my questions were answered for me to care about continuing on. Not my favorite. However, a graphic novel that I did really enjoy this winter was Baba Yaga's Assistant by Marika McCool, illustrated by Emily Carroll of Through the Woods fame. I saw this on Mercedes' channel for Mercy's Bookish Musings. My library didn't have a copy, so darn, I had to buy it. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The illustrations are wonderful. I really love the use of color and how the tone shifts depending upon if we're looking at a fairy tale or looking at real life. I didn't give this 5 stars just because I wanted more of the story. I thought it kind of didn't have just enough meat for my teeth to chew on, but I was highly impressed with this, and I will for sure be looking at anything else graphic novel wise or comic wise that Emily Carroll is illustrating that comes out in the future. Next, I want to talk to you about The Trick is to Keep Breathing by Janice Galloway. Aren't you proud of me again? This was one of my top 5 books to get to in 2016 and I already read it. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars, so it was a bit disappointing, but not as much as Lumberjanes or The Subtle Knife. This started out so strong language-wise. It was so beautiful and used imagery in a really wonderful way, but unfortunately, by halfway through the book, that language just dropped away. And that's really what intrigued me, or what made me so excited to read this in the first place, was the use of language. This, though, is an important look at depression and mental illness in general, especially when it intersects with the mental health system, specifically in Scotland here, but probably it applies to the rest of the UK, if not the rest of the Western world. The mental health system's not great. This also is fairly experimental in its form, so it's just got a lot of broken up passages, and you'll see things smushed up into the margins. So it's a very interesting book, but not nearly as beautifully written as I desperately wanted it to be. I also read some 40 Tales from the Afterlives by David Eagleman. Nailed it. This I also gave 3 stars, unfortunately. So this is a collection of very short stories, 2 to 3 pages in length, positing different experiences of the afterlife. The whole point of this is to give you examples of the afterlife that'll make you reflect on your living life, your current life. But I found that a lot of them started to sound samey to me. Perhaps I tried to read them too quickly, too close together, but I don't think that you should have to know how to read a short story collection to enjoy it. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't get as much out of it as I was hoping. However, there were some really beautiful stories in here, and you can check my Goodreads review of this to see which ones I really liked. I finished listening to The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles by Haruki Murakami, translated by Jay Rubin, narrated by Rupert Degas, who's my favorite audiobook narrator of all time. So when I saw that he was narrating this, I knew I could never read The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles. I'd have to listen to it. That being said, having listened to it, I don't think I paid as close attention to the text as I would have had I read it. So perhaps in 10, 20 years, when I want to reread this chunker of a book, I'll actually physically read it. But it was such an enjoyable listening experience. The story was really intricate, had so many characters I really enjoyed. That was one difference between this and Norwegian Wood. I found there were so many secondary characters, female characters as well, especially, that I really enjoyed hearing their stories of, like Krita Kano and Mei Kasahara. They were some of my favorites. This did have quite a bit of gore or violence in it. Like, there's a flaying alive scene that took me off guard. I wasn't expecting that. So Murakami, but all in all, this was a 4 out of 5 star read, and I am still really enjoying Murakami and excited to continue on with his work. This winter, I also read 2 books by Patrick Ness. First being The Rest of Us Just Live Here. This is a book about the non-chosen ones in a world where there are chosen ones. This has a really interesting structure. At the beginning of each chapter, you get an almost bullet point paragraph of what's happening to the chosen ones in this fantasy, crazy, what's happening, apocalypse sort of scenario. And then the rest of the chapter focuses on Mikey and Mel, Jared and Henna, these normal kids just trying to get by in high school. Mikey suffers from OCD and Mel is a recovering anorexic and bulimic. So this has a very interesting and respectful discussion about those sorts of mental illness in this. I was so impressed with that aspect of this book. This also has some queer characters in it and some perspectives on exploring sexuality that I was also completely impressed with, so on board with the messages in here that Patrick Ness wrote. This was a really fast read, really well done, I thought, and it just made me really, really impressed with Patrick Ness. The only word I know how to say with Patrick Ness apparently is impressed. So I did pick up more than this right after I finished The Rest of Us Just Live Here. And yay, another one of the top 5 books I want to get to in 2016 already under my belt. I enjoyed this as much as The Rest of Us Just Live Here, though I must say that the way this story took, the direction it took, isn't my favorite trope in YA or just general fiction, so I wasn't expecting that. But even if those thematic elements moments weren't my favorite, this was still really well done. And this has a really wonderful commentary on like building your own family. This also covers some really dark topics, but does them really well. And I think like just thorough enough without ruminating or dwelling on these really dark topics. So I highly recommend this one. This was really, really interesting. And for sure, I will be picking up more by Patrick Ness. I'm looking at you, Chaos Walking Trilogy. I also read The Singular and Extraordinary Tale of Mira and Goliath by Ishbel B. This was upon recommendation by Acacia, and it got 4 stars as well. This is a really interesting 4-star though, because I don't think this book was necessarily well written. It felt very much like the first draft of a novel that was trying to do a lot of different things and just didn't quite work how to get them all done. Also, this changes point of view in different chapters, and I felt that the voice sounded very much the same, so oftentimes when I started a chapter, I wasn't quite sure who was speaking, and I had to like flip through to see if I could figure out who it was. In the end, I did figure it out every single time. But the reason why this got 4 out of 5 stars as opposed to 3 or maybe even 2 based upon like how the book was constructed, I couldn't help but enjoy this story and all of the different characters in it. It's also the time period. It's set in Victorian with a little bit of steampunk and definitely some magic and demons. That was just a flavor I just adored and enjoying and reading. There was also like 3 times the word mermaid came up in here. There weren't any mermaids per se, but just the fact that that word was used, I was just like, Ishbel B, you know me. So yeah, this was a really strange 4-star, but it was so enjoyable, such a fast read, and it also had some interesting forms as well. It played a lot around with text font and also text size and how it's laid out on the page, and I thought that was a really creative element. So not as polished as I hoped it would be, but a lot of fun and thoroughly enjoyable, and eventually I'll be reading the second one in this series. I also picked up Pond by Claire Louise Bennett this winter. I bought this in December, but Victoria from A Hermit's Progress really wanted to know my thoughts on this, so that's what made me pick it up especially soon. This was another 4 out of 5 star read. This is a interconnected short story collection in that these are short stories, but all from the perspective of the same character, who is a solitary middle-aged or young middle-aged woman, I think, living in this small town in Western Ireland. This talks a lot about just solitude and the way that thoughts can wander when you're on your own and you're just left to your own mind's devices. There were some absolutely wonderful passages. I underlined the bejesus out of this. In fact, let me read you one of these passages. This is from page 21, so my underlining started on page 21 and went throughout the entire book. In fact, I think it was considered rather unsophisticated, and I remember feeling, despite my new floral chemise, suddenly sullen and practically gothic. Actually, now that I come to think of it, I think the gist of my argument was simply that love is indeed a vicious and divine disintegration of selfhood, and that artistic representations of it as such aren't at all uncommon or outlandish, and have nothing whatsoever to do with endeavoring to shock the audience. There was an awful lot of violence, you see, in the work of the playwright the conference was reputedly reassessing, and by and large that violence had hitherto been widely interpreted as nothing more than a dramatic strategy designed to shock, which I could never quite accept, because how on earth is there anything shocking about violence? So they're just interesting little vignettes and tidbits in the mind of one fictional woman, I assume. The only reason why this didn't get 5 stars is that there were short stories of longer length, maybe like 30 pages, and in between those were short stories that were a paragraph, a page long, and I found that most of those really short stories weren't nearly as powerful as the long ones. So with that discrepancy, I couldn't give it 5, but I really enjoyed it, and I am certainly looking forward to rereading this in the future and noting all the things that I underlined. The last short story collection I got to in winter was At the Mouth of the River of Bees by Kaj Johnson. This was fabulous. Kaj Johnson knows how to do short stories. I was just amazed. Even the short stories that I didn't particularly care for, I could definitely tell the craft that was in them, the pacing, knowing when to give details, when to elaborate, when to just leave it at that. and I couldn't help but admire every single one of these stories. Apart from some stories not being my thing, like Ponies and Spar, I also was kind of irritated at the novella-length The Man Who Bridged the Mist short story at the end of this. I prefer short story collections that have generally the same sort of time it takes that you put into each story. So by the time I got to this, The Man Who Bridged the Mist was the second to last story in this. So by the time I was at the end, I was chomping at the bit to just finish this because, you know, it's exciting to finish a book. And having that novella to face was a little bit but even so, this got 5 stars. This couldn't not get 5 stars. One story made me well up in tears. The other one made me almost openly weep. The first 3 short stories were some of my favorites, and after learning that fox magic inspired The Foxwoman, I picked up The Foxwoman by Kais Johnson, which is a novel based on that short story. I've already read it, gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was almost a 5-star. It was great. So yes, this was a perfect introduction to Kais Johnson, and also I think an exemplary example of what a short story collection can be, can do, and can contain. The last book I want to talk to you about is a new children's book new to me, that I've discovered that I need to own because, oh my goodness. And that is The Beauty and the Beast, retold by Max Ehlenberg and illustrated by Angela Barrett. I'm a huge fan of The Beauty and the Beast. It's my favorite fairy tale. And it's funny because when I was growing up, I always thought that I was Beauty not because I was beautiful, but because I could see people beyond their skin, having to fight with that, being a fat child with a big ugly scar on her leg. I knew that people were more than what they looked like. However, in recent years, I've come to identify more with the Beast. What with being a little bit self-pitying, living alone, I can be really curmudgeon-y and really snappish and gloomy, and often full of near despair at my lovelessness. So yeah, me and the Beast, we're totally more bros than me and Beauty are anyway. This retelling of Beauty and the Beast really made me feel for the Beast. Most of the time in children's retellings, it's like the Beast is this character that you tolerate and are kind of weirded out by depending upon the retelling, until the magical end can happen, and then you're like, oh, okay, now I know why I dealt with him this entire time, and it's a story about Beauty. But I thought that this story really brought to light the suffering of the Beast and what it would really be like to be him in his situation without fleshing out his background more. That was the thing. It was all captured just within mostly the illustrations. It was also really interesting Beast design. I've never seen a Beast portrayed like this before, which was so refreshing, having seen and read many, many retellings of The Beauty and the Beast. So this was just wonderful. I adored it. It was so great. And it was also a wonderful retelling as well. Like, it really fleshed out Beauty and her family, which I really appreciated, because her sisters and father are another one of those things in the story that most people just tolerate till you get to Beauty and the Beast. Do you know what I mean? So this was so well done. So well done. And thank you, Lola Raven, for recommending that I check out some books illustrated by Angela Barrett, because you weren't wrong. It was totally worth it. So if I didn't make it plain, 5 stars. 5 stars. I need to buy my own copy eventually. So that's what I read, the highlights of what I read in winter. Please stay tuned for the upcoming videos where I will talk more about those books that I didn't talk about but did talk about. Do you know what I'm saying? I hope you enjoyed this wrap up. I certainly had a glorious winter and look forward to spring. Could you please let me know down in the comments below your favorite read of the winter this past season? I would certainly love to creep on your life a little bit more and comment on what you're reading. Thank you for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely. Yes! Yes! Power came back on. Okay, haven't had power for an hour and a half.